if you would be so kind to introduce our next guest, I would appreciate that.
Sure. Thanks, Bobby. So our next guest I'm pleased to bring to you today is Kim Rutledge, the director of the California Department of Rehabilitation. Governor Gavin Newsom appointed Kim as the director of the Department of Rehabilitation in January of 2025. In this role, Kim leads the nation's largest vocational rehabilitation and independent living programs, which advances employment and independence for people with disabilities. Kim has been with DOR since May of 2022 when she joined the department as deputy director of the Office of Legislation and Communications. Previously, Kim held multiple positions at the California Department of Social Services, including being policy branch chief for in-home supportive services and program administrator for adult protective services. So with that, I will pass the mic on over to you, Kim. Happy to have you here. Go ahead. You're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here this morning and was really excited to hear Director Watanabe's presentation as well. I learned a lot about her department and recently at the ACCET Awards a couple weeks ago, first learned about the Someone Like Me program that DMHC has. And I think that that's a really great segue into my remarks this morning because Bobby and Alex had asked me to talk a little bit about creating a disability culture in your workplace. And DOR has a reputation, in my opinion, and from what I hear from others, of being a department that has a very strong disability culture. We have a very high percentage of employees in our department, the highest of any state department, of people with disabilities, and we really pride ourselves in the disability culture that we create. But for me personally, I have not always worked in a culture where there was a disability culture, and certainly spent most of my career not working with people like me. People like me, maybe professionally, but definitely not people who look like me. I forgot to do my physical description earlier, so I'll take a pause and do that. I am a middle-aged white woman with short curly hair. And today I'm wearing a blue floral shirt and have a pride background in the background of my Zoom. And I am also a power wheelchair user, and I don't have use of my arms, and so I do most everything with my feet. And I give that little extra description of my physical disability because the interesting thing about being on Zoom, and this is something that I saw during Director Watanabe's presentation in the chat a lot, is people talking about being stared at, people talking about being different and looking different in the work environment. And I have spent 30 years of my career being somebody who looks different, moves different, does my job differently, but does the same thing as everybody else. And that has been an interesting thing to navigate over the course of my career. I've been with the state of California for about 9 years, but prior to being at the state, I spent my whole career working in the private sector. When I went to college, I initially studied journalism and wanted to be a newspaper journalist. And so for about 10 years after my college graduation, that's what I did. And this was in the late 90s and early 2000s, in the early years of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the ADA, which is turning 35 next month, has an entire provision around employment and around reasonable accommodations and making employment accessible for all people who want to pursue it. And I worked in many environments in my journalism career, and then even initially when I switched careers, that I was the only person with a visible physical disability out of hundreds or sometimes even thousands of employees. And so it's interesting to be asked about what a disability culture looks like in a workplace, because I've spent most of my career in a work environment that didn't even have a disability culture. Like if you would have said to me, what's the disability culture like in your workplace? I would have laughed because I would have been like, it's me, I'm it. And obviously, I know that I probably wasn't it, and there were probably plenty of people in all of these workplaces with invisible disabilities at the time. but that was not my experience. I didn't work with people like me. And when it came to my own reasonable accommodations, what was available to me by the law and what was available to me in a workplace, I had to figure out most of that myself. I didn't work in environments where there was a reasonable accommodations coordinator. There was maybe somebody in the HR office who had a little bit of experience or maybe an hour-long training on what a reasonable accommodation was. And there were a lot of things now that I remember asking for that probably were reasonable accommodations and things I get in my job today as an employee of the state of California that I didn't get 25, 30 years ago in the workplace. Also, as being someone who had a really visible disability in a workplace, I was often the person that everybody else would go to for any kind of disability related question, whether I knew the answer or not. And if there ever was any other employee that even had some sort of temporary disability, they would come to me and be like, what do we do about this person? So oftentimes when you're the only person in a work environment with a disability, you end up becoming the expert on disability, whether you are or not. Moving through my career in environments where I was one of the only people with a disability also was really challenging because I think that oftentimes people with disabilities in workplaces are not necessarily seen as people who can grow and expand in their careers and eventually become leaders and even directors. And at DOR, being in a department that promotes and provides employment services for people with disabilities, I'm proud that I am not the first director to be a person with a disability, and I'm sure I won't be the last either. But that is an opportunity that is not afforded a lot of people, mostly because of assumptions that people have around what people with disabilities bring to the workplace and what they don't bring. I came to DOR in 2022 after spending, as I said, a number of years working as a journalist and then working in the private sector in the legislative arena, and then coming over to the state and working at a different state department before I came to DOR. And when I came to DOR, that was the first time I had ever truly worked in an organization where I had many peers, colleagues, and bosses who had disabilities. The majority of the executive team identified as people with disabilities. 30% of DOR's rank and file staff identify as having a disability. And that culture really informs the way that we engage with everyone, the way that we engage with the people who come to us receiving services, and the way that we engage with each other around our disabilities, and the way that we as leaders engage with our staff. And it helps us also understand the intersection of disability. It makes us realize that people with disabilities are whole, full people. And at DOR, we have a number of affinity groups for a variety of different populations, including our African American Task Force, our LGBTQ affinity groups, and others that are led by people with disabilities who also identify in those other populations. And we have these groups to really lift up the fact that people with disabilities come to the workplace or come to us for services in any department as full and complex individuals. And we want to really celebrate that and acknowledge that. So having an inclusive disability culture is so important to the work that we do. And I know that Director Watanabe spent a fair amount of time this morning discussing the return to office, which I know is an extremely hot topic right now. And I think that I was asked to kind of talk about reasonable accommodations a little bit in relation to disability culture. And I think that a lot of times both staff and managers are really intimidated by the reasonable accommodation process. And the first and foremost thing that I'll say about that is that the RA process can go much better for everyone if your organization has a good disability culture to begin with. If you have a culture that has people at all levels with disabilities, with that actual lived experience, and who have expertise and understanding in disability, then when someone comes to their manager with a reasonable accommodation request, it makes it easier and more seamless for everyone to be able to work through. Right now, I know that reasonable accommodations are a very hot topic with the return to office. Managers are an integral part of this process, and they work directly with their staff when RAs are requested. At DOR, we and now have our managers go to an entire reasonable accommodation staff to work through the RA process. And while it's individualized, there are some basics that every manager and every HR staff need to know before working with a staff or on their reasonable accommodation. They must really understand what a reasonable accommodation is and what it isn't, and be able to articulate that to staff. And I'm really going to spend a couple of minutes on this one because I think I'm seeing even at DOR this being something that's really coming up with the RTO. I know that our department has gotten some pushback lately that we're not offering reasonable accommodations because we're telling people they have to come back to the office. And a reasonable accommodation can mean many, many things. For us at DOR and at the other departments that fall under the governor's executive order, the way that we are approaching reasonable accommodation is by looking at ways to be able to accommodate the individual to be in the office for the required 4 days a week. And that looks like many different things for many different people. And that is really the baseline. And the reason I say that is the baseline is because in the disability community for generations now, we have fought really hard to be considered equal with people who do not have disabilities as well. And part of that equity is, having the opportunity to work in the same environment as people without disabilities. I've said this a couple times before, and I know that it doesn't always sit well with people, but people would have a lot of issues if there was suddenly, an executive order that everybody has to go back to the office except for people who fall under a particular racial or ethnic. I think somebody came off mute. Thank you. Whatever. Anyway, we would really push back if it was like, oh, well, people who are brown don't have to come back into the office, just, every other racial or ethnic group. And when we say, that people with disabilities should just automatically have the exception of not having to come back into the office, that doesn't necessarily give the message that we want to put, because we want to see people in our workplaces that, to Director Watanabe's point, look like us and are serving people like us, and find ways to make that work. And as I've mentioned earlier, find ways to make that work at all levels of leadership, from the office technician all the way up to somebody at my level. And managers need to really remember that and need to find ways as much as they can to be able to accommodate people in the environment, because that is really what a reasonable accommodation is. It's taking the job and what the requirements of the job are and finding ways to make it work for the person with their disability. For managers who are maybe a little bit nervous or a little bit scared about working with the interactive process, it's important to really develop a rapport with your staff, develop trust, and have an understanding of what their needs are. So when they come to you and they need some kind of accommodation, instead of just either shutting them down or sending them directly to HR or saying that isn't possible, really finding creative ways to work with people. And I know right now at DOR, we're looking at lots of creative ways of working with people, whether that's helping someone find a quiet room or, putting their cubicle closer to a restroom, or finding, a special chair, or whatever it is. And I know that different people come in with all different types of disabilities, and there's lots of ways to accommodate people in an office environment. It's also important for a manager, even if HR gets involved, to continue to be engaged in the interactive process all the way through until the reasonable accommodation is agreed upon. and keeping that communication and that trust both open throughout the process. I've also been asked today to cover a little bit about retaining employees with disabilities. And I think that leading to having that good interactive process, having that good disability culture, both of those things together is what will lead to retention for employees with disabilities. Fostering that positive culture around disability doesn't end for a manager or for staff once the RA interactive process is complete. It is important to include your employees with disabilities at the table, both in and out of the office. And let me take a moment to talk about what that looks like. What that looks like in the office is making sure that you see that employee with a disability as someone who has potential, someone who is an equal contributor to the team, someone who has as much of a right to literally be at the table and be in the discussion and bring their ideas and their talents and their abilities to the job. And when I talk about including employees at the table outside the office, I'm going to talk a little bit about that for a second, because there are, especially with the return to office, there are things that happen outside the office as well. You'll have a team that goes to lunch together. You'll have side conversations in the break room. And oftentimes what I have found for myself is making sure that you're choosing the place to go to lunch offsite at a place that is accessible for everyone. Making sure that your deaf employees have access to an ASL interpreter, not just for the meeting that they need to be in, but also for the side conversations that happen before and after the meeting and in the break room and anywhere else. Making sure like being an inclusive environment is not just about getting the physical work done and not just about how we accommodate people in the office, but it's really truly having that sense of inclusion in all aspects of what work is. And I think that that's really the way that we retain employees in state government with disabilities. And developing employees with all kinds of disabilities. The state has several great programs for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including a couple of different internship programs, the state internship program, which is an alternative to taking the exam for certain classifications. There's also a program for people with developmental disabilities who are interested in CEA level leadership. And there's one of those positions in each agency throughout the state of California, but not just for managers and for leaders at the state, looking at employees regardless of the type of disability they have and thinking about what the possibility is instead of what the restriction is, I think is a very, very important piece of having an inclusive culture and retaining your employees with disabilities. Also, not being afraid to increase the responsibilities and provide training and development opportunities to employees with disabilities. I was really lucky at a previous state department that I worked at. I had an opportunity to go through a mid-level management training, and that training had been going on at that department for many, many years. And as far as I'm aware, I was the first employee with a disability to ever go through that training, because when I arrived at the location on the first day, the bathroom was not physically accessible. I was unable to get my wheelchair in or out of the bathroom at the location. And they had been having this management training, this year-long cohort for many, many years at this location. And I was the first employee to ever go through that training who needed that accommodation. And that really said a lot to me. That said to me that I was in a department where I was the first person that had ever reached that level to go through that training and do all of that. And so they didn't have to think about accommodation at that leadership level. And we have to think about accommodation at that leadership level if we're going to retain employees and if we're going to celebrate and foster an environment where people with disabilities can grow in their careers. So today I know that I am speaking to all of you as representatives of your disability advisory committees and as the state DAC. And as representatives, you all have a voice. You have an ability within your departments to create a strong disability culture, and that starts with each of you. And that will then, in turn, create an environment where reasonable accommodations are more welcome and more understood. And it will increase your outcomes when it comes to retaining the talent and success of employees of all abilities. And with that, those are my remarks for this morning, and I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Right. Thank you, Kim. Appreciate the presentation. A lot of great info. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to switch over to spotlighting. Thank you, Bobby. I see there. So I am also looking through some notes that I took, and I am on the topic of disability culture. So I have a background for a few years in being in safety culture, and that's where I've seen parallels in different cultures, such as disability culture. And so all aspects of the culture, whether safety or disability culture or otherwise, they evolve over time. So I'm wondering, other than agency-related required reporting, does DOR track metrics and data of its disability culture as it evolves? And if DOR does this, what sort of metrics are these? And just some examples of the data that's collected. And then as a follow-up, how often is this evaluated and how often are agency-wide changes implemented?
Um, so I think that culture is a really difficult thing, I think, to quantify. We certainly track the number of employees that we have with disabilities, and even that is a little bit difficult to track because not everyone fills out the survey that certifies. But we're able to, we send that out. We've also, much as Director Watanabe mentioned earlier, we've spent some time trying to train some of our staff in how to fill out that survey. But that is really, we have the same ability to track how many employees with disabilities that we have as any other state department does. But if we do see dips in that, then that will be areas where we go back and look at what we're doing within our own culture to make that change. And we've been able to remain pretty steady at around a 30% employee with disability rate for a fair amount of time now. So I don't know if that fully answers your question. It's sort of a hard thing to quantify with data, other than the data of the number of employees we have and the types of disabilities that they have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kim. And then as a related question, is the DOR's DAC involved in efforts towards changing the culture, and are they involved in the internal conversations about policy changes?
They are. They meet regularly and are involved in those discussions the same way that a DAC at any other department is.
Okay, thanks. And then one last question for me. And please correct me if I'm wrong, though my understanding is that the interactive process is not standardized and can vary from agency to agency. So just generally speaking, how would you see a, a good interactive process functioning?
How I see a good interactive process functioning. Well, I think that a lot of what I discovered, I think that it really has to do with, first of all, understanding reasonable accommodations, as I mentioned earlier, and understanding what is and what isn't from the standpoint of the law. Because I think especially in the RTO environment, we're seeing a lot of things that are being framed as reasonable accommodations and that's not necessarily what the request is. And what a reasonable accommodation is from the standpoint of the law is finding a way to accommodate someone to be able to do the essential functions of the job, whatever the essential functions of the job are. So I think that that's really the first piece. I think the next piece, though, is as I mentioned earlier, the trust factor, being able to have an interactive process where you have a culture where the employee trusts their manager enough to be able to go to them, be open, and for the manager to be able to listen and, not shut them down right away. But then also having people on your reasonable accommodation staff who are there to support the manager and have an understanding of what the actual accommodations are. And our reasonable accommodation team at DOR is very creative when it comes to looking at various ways to accommodate people's needs to be able to do the essential functions of the job.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Great info. Sorry, I'm also looking through the side chat to see if there's any questions at the same time.
Yeah.
Have you caught any?
Glenn with hands up. Glenn, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Bobby. If I may, let me try to lower my hand. Thank you so much, Kim, for that wonderful presentation. And I really like that thought you mentioned earlier about, that whether we like it or not, but because of the challenges we navigate for in terms of disability or in services or neurodivergent care and things like that, we eventually become an expert, sort of an expert on the matter. I really like that thought because I too have a lot of challenges in navigating. And I don't know if you were here earlier, I also mentioned that I'm also trying to reach out to neurodivergent affirming providers, and that has been a challenge for the past few months, if not years. So the question I have, I'm also very glad that I'm able to interface with the Department of Rehabilitation. I have a couple of questions on the rehabilitation services. I'm very fortunate to have been able to interface with your counselors, both for my son and for myself. And the two questions I have is the challenges also I'm having, navigated together with my counselor are those rehabilitation service providers for the Department of Rehabilitation. And the only frame of reference I have for that is that, here on medical, we have medical provider enrollments, but for service providers or vendors for Department of Rehabilitation, it seems like there is some challenges on finding out a way to become a service provider in your department or a vendor. And I even, to a certain extent, ask your counselor if there is a list of service providers, or is there a way for a provider to be sort of registered on Enroll and provide services? So that's the question I'm having, and I'm still not getting the information that I'm getting. That's number one. And then number two, my other question I had for my counselor, what about if the rehabilitation services have been put together, have been approved or denied by the counselor? The question is there an appeal mechanism? The only frame of reference to that I have too would be the regional centers, where they have, where it takes them like a few months to determine eligibility, and they also have sort of appeal mechanism with regards to their determination of eligibility. So those are the two questions I have. One is, how does one become a vendor or service provider in the Department of Rehabilitation? And number two, is there like an appeals mechanism for the services that has been approved or denied? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. For the first question, I would invite you to reach out to me, and I'll put my email in the chat directly about the vendorization question, because that's a little complicated, and don't think that this is really the forum to get into the weeds of that end, but happy to provide that information offline. And a lot of the details I don't know myself, but I can get you in contact with our team that does that work. And then as for the appeals process, yes, anyone who comes through DOR seeking employment services has a right to appeal the decision. And we have all of that information on the website, and every consumer of DOR should receive that information when they are receiving services as well.
Thank you, Glenn, for a great question. And thank you, Director Rutledge. I'm going to read off some questions from the chat, then we're going to go back to Amy. She has her hand up. One of the comment from Christina says, our DAC worked with HR to review and provide feedback on internal reasonable accommodation policy. They implemented a lot of suggestions, and DAC continues to monitor implementation of other suggestions. Is that true within your department, Director Rutledge, as well?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sure. This comes from Christina.
Oh, Christina. Okay.
Right.
I'm scrolling through the questions here myself, so I just want to make sure I fully understand the question.
Yes.
So I'm giving work with HR. Okay. That continues to monitor. Which question? I'm sorry. I'm going to have you. I lost the question in the chat.
There are a lot of questions. I'm going to read this slowly, and stop me if I need to repeat. That's fine. So, she says, our DAC worked with HR to review and provide feedback on our internal reasonable accommodation policy. They implemented a lot of suggestions, and the DAC continues to monitor implementation of other suggestions. So in other words, DACs appear to be engaged in developing, recommending these reasonable accommodation policy to their HR, and the executive and their department have implemented many of those recommended policies. So I'm wondering if that's something that you do as well.
That is not something that we currently do at DOR, but I will say, and I know we've received several questions about DOR's DAC specifically, and our DAC is kind of undergoing a little bit of a transformation right now. There's a lot of new members, and we have a new equity officer who has taken over the oversight of the DAC. So our DAC, I'm imagining over the course of the next year, is going to become a lot more active.
The other question that came is, it seems like the DOR RA process being supported by managers, but who supports the employee? The DOR RA sounds like HR is supporting the manager. In other words, their question specifically, there is a group of people within your department supporting the manager navigate the RA process, but who is actually counseling and advising the employees as well?
I would say that HR is supporting both. I would say that really, and we've recently made some changes to our processes for RA at DOR as well, where we really have someone from HR, the manager, and the employee all in an interactive discussion together. And I think that that's really a good point, is that the interactive process truly is a process. And it's not supposed to be an adversarial HR and the manager versus the employee. And when we say, who's going to advocate, represent the employee, really an RA should never be adversarial. And I think that some of this language that we're using makes it sound like it's a little bit adversarial, but really it should be an ongoing interactive discussion, an ongoing interactive process between the manager, the employee, and the RA staff and HR.
Great. Communication based on trust and collaboration rather than adversarial in nature is what you're trying to imply here.
100%, Bobby, 100%.
Thank you. Carrie, you have your hand up. Go ahead, unmute.
Yes. Just in defense of DOR's DAC, when I was there, we were rewriting the RA policy because the CalHR recommendations for the new RA policies had come out, and the DAC did weigh in, and we worked very closely with them at the time. So I know there's been changes, but just in defense of the DAC and DOR, they did chime in, and we discussed it quite a bit. So
excellent testimony that proves the point of what Director Rutledge was stating. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carrie. I know that you did a lot of great work on that when you were at DOR, and it's good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.
All right. If you don't have any other question, we'll go to Amy. Amy, go ahead, unmute, ask your question.
Thank you. I have a question in relation to the program for path to employment. I was involved a little bit previously, but I think it's kind of stalled out, and nobody really knows where to pick it up because the people that were doing it have left. But DOR has an SIP and a LEAP process. And I'm wondering if, one, you can explain the difference between the SIP and LEAP on its own, and then two, how departments can participate with the SIP process in addition to the LEAP.
Okay. I'm going to do the best that I can with this answer. First of all, noting that CalHR and not DOR actually administers the LEAP program and the SIP program. What DOR does is the certification for people to go on a LEAP list. So I will explain to the best of my ability the difference between LEAP and the LEAP state internship program. So LEAP itself, over the course of for many, many years was about 10 different classifications and now has been expanded to over 100 classifications that individuals with disabilities can do an alternative exam to be able to be on the eligibility list other than the standard exam for that position. And then LEAP state internship program, or the LEAP SIP, is for individuals specifically with intellectual or developmental disabilities who are interested in state service. And it is actually an internship program that is, I believe, 512 hours doing the job as an intern, as a paid intern. And typically it's a job, I think it's like OT jobs, a lot of things like that. And at the end of that 512-hour internship, then you don't have to take the exam for the position. That is in lieu of the exam. So that is how the state internship program works. It's specifically an alternative to an exam for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, whereas LEAP is an alternative exam for anybody with any kind of disability for certain classifications.
And Eli volunteered to clarify the LEAP and SIP. Eli happens to be the representative from CalHR who's going to be coming on later. And
Thank you. That will be helpful.
Thank you, Eli. Do we have any other question for Director Rutledge? I have a couple of questions for you, Director Rutledge, while people are thinking about it. In the interactive process, you mentioned everyone's involved and so forth. So what happens when an employee is asking and engaged in the interactive process and they're asking for something that has not fully been developed, approved, been decided upon, because it's still engaged in that discussion? In the interim, how is that employees navigating that gap period, if you will, between approval or denial of RA and interactive process and the essential functions of the job that the employee is required to make and perform?
Okay, so let me make sure I understand your question correctly, Bobby. You're asking if what an employee does during the interim process while they have an RA request, but it hasn't been fulfilled yet.
Right.
There's interim accommodations that can be made for people. You can come up with all kinds of different things, and I think that this is where RTO may come in handy in some situations. Being able to, while you're making an office setting accessible for someone, being able to allow them to work from home or something like that. But there's lots of things that can be done in an interim state. And I don't want to go into too many examples simply because the RA process is so individualized.
So in your department, largely while they're negotiating, they can do the remote work while that matter is being finalized in some cases.
If that is what is determined appropriate for that individual. I'm just using that as an example. That's not necessarily something that is done for all people.
Right. there's a very long question being posed here. Are you able to read this, or would you like me to read?
Yeah.
Shannon?
Or I can read it.
We should
Yes.
read it out loud. We should read it out loud for anyone who can't see it.
Okay, that's fine. Sorry for the length here. It just took me a while to get to the question. So I said that I have a question regarding how you suggest starting to create and grow disability culture at the workplace. Ableism is a powerful implicit bias that can influence mindset when managers or other coworkers respond to employees with disabilities, and that's whether it's an RA or a not. I think about the quote, nothing about us without us, in terms of disability rights. It sounds as if disabilities have been destigmatized at the DOR, partly because people at all levels are out about their disabilities. And it's fantastic just to, as a side note, to hear about that culture. However, at most workplaces, disabilities are more so hidden and kept private. What advice would you have for a workplace that is trying to bolster disability culture, where a culture of stigma still exists, whether actual or perceived? How do you suggest to empower people with disabilities in this workplace, and how to help train people who might not have as much experience with the possibilities and benefits of disability culture?
Thanks for the question. I think that the first place is kind of where I ended my remarks, which is I think that for many departments that don't have the same culture and the same number of people who are out about their disabilities as DOR does, I think that really that can start with your DAC. That can start with having, next month is Disability Pride Month, and it's the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. DACs are a great place to start for having awareness events around that. With the return to office, lots of people want to know about reasonable accommodations, having brown bag lunches, having for Disability Pride and for NDEAM, maybe having speakers come and give testimonials. There's a lot of great films and media and different things that show the history of the disability rights movement. Like starting really with that education and getting staff engaged at that level while actively hiring people with disabilities. DOR is not the only department where people with disabilities work and where people with disabilities can work. And I think that for those of you who are hiring managers and or in positions to help influence hiring decisions, the more people that we bring into the workplace with disabilities, that process naturally starts to evolve. But there are tools out there, there's media. I see someone just put in the chat a reference to the film Crip Camp, which is a great film that is about the history of the disability rights movement. And there's a lot of really great materials out there, and feel free also to reach out to DOR for both Disability Pride and for NDEAM. Our communications team is great at helping people have the tools they need to do their own events and provide a little bit of advice and guidance as well. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. And as members of your department DACs, you are in a powerful position to be able to do that.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any other additional question for Director Rutledge?
I'm not seeing any. Anyone? Quick moment, see if anybody just has a question. If not,
Well, if not, I'm going to ask a quick question as a follow-up to what Director Rutledge mentioned earlier. You know, it's very important you distinguished the difference between what RA and what's RA not. And the default from what I heard you mention is that try to accommodate the employee's need within the workplace in response to the 4-day return to office mandate. In other words, try to make the office as accommodating as possible. And that's the default. Did I get that right, or am I?
100%.
Okay. But you don't actually disagree or think that the FEHA or ADA is subordinate to the governor's executive order of return to office mandate, right? In other words,
I don't know if I fully understand that question or if I'm really comfortable answering it.
All right. So let me break that down a little bit. We have ADA, the federal laws. We have FEHA, the state laws. Then we have the governor's executive order, which says return to office, the 4-day mandate. The other two bodies of law concerning disability access rights, all of that, is superior to the governor's executive order, correct?
I'm not a lawyer. I
Oh.
don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
What I will say is that before the pandemic, most people came into the office and were accommodated that way. And the understanding of the ADA, which also plays into this too, is that from a reasonable accommodation standpoint, that you accommodate people to be able to do the essential functions of the job. And my understanding is that the governor's executive order means that the essential functions of the job include coming into the office 4 days a week.
No, you're absolutely right. And the governor's executive order also makes exceptions, reasonable accommodation. The accommodation should happen wherever it's at work, at remote location, or wherever the work is being done. But if the default is try to get people to come back to the office, then that's where the focus would be, as you explained earlier.
The default isn't try to get people into the office. The default is people will be required to come into the office 4 days a week.
Okay.
And so working around that requirement.
Right. And to do that is try to make the office as accessible and accommodating as possible. And there was a question posted earlier in this chat, and that is, do you have areas where a person who needs rest that can lay down and rest, or is it a different type of arrangement that you have for a person with disabilities needing that kind of support?
That's a really individualized accommodation that I know that our reasonable accommodation staff work around situations like that, but I don't want to speak to specifics because, again, each individualized RA is very individualized.
Right. Absolutely. I thank you so much for clarifying and highlighting this. And the thing that I would mention is the disability culture. You explain how DOR did a great job of creating that disability culture. And a lot of departments actually struggle to do that. And the disability parity rate shows that struggle demonstrated. I mean, you're forefront. You're like one of the best performer in that area, and so did DHMC and a few others. But there are only a handful of them. So what would you say to those departments that are struggling to achieve the disability parity rate in becoming more like you? How would you provide that leadership, guidance, and example?
I think that it's a lot of what we already talked about. It's not being afraid to hire people with disabilities. It's being open to the possibilities of what all people bring into the work environment. And also, I think that when I believe that there's going to be a speaker after me that really talks about the LEAP process a little bit more. And for hiring managers, there are some mechanisms in place where you can get a LEAP only list for hiring individuals, and those types of lists will be able to, give you a pool specifically of employees with disabilities to hire. And I think that using tools like that I think my colleague from CalHR will discuss later, are also good tools for that as well.
And another question posted by Karen: what happens to agencies who don't have the office space as they used to, staff having to share cubicles, no conference room or safe space room due to being turned into spaces for employees to work? This is
I can only speak to what is happening at DOR right now, and I know that every department is approaching this in a different way, so I don't want to necessarily speak to that right now.
Okay. But you don't have this problem. Obviously, you have ample office area to accommodate whatever you need, sounds like.
For the Department of Rehabilitation, we are intending to and have the space to bring people back 4 days a week starting July 1st.
Excellent.
That's and I cannot speak to other departments beyond DOR.
Right. Sure. Of course. Well, thank you so much. Are there any other questions for Director Rutledge? Alex?
No, I'm not seeing any additional questions. I think you covered the last one that was in the chat, Bobby. So just 1 second, just double checking to make sure. Yeah, that seems to be everything. So, Bobby, go ahead.
Well, Director Rutledge, is there any last words you want to share with us and all the good work that you do and your department does for our disability community?
I'll just close by saying that DOR is a great resource to staff with disabilities, to managers with disabilities, and we really encourage any of you that have questions about how to navigate the employment of people with disabilities in your workplaces, please feel free to reach out. Our team, this is what we do, and this is what we believe in as a department. And I am so excited to lead this department and lead this important work. And we are here for your DAC, and we are here to help provide resources to you, especially during this time of RTO and beyond.
Thank you so much for that offer. Great presentation. We learned a lot. I appreciate the topic on disability, culture change, and awareness. It's been great presentation, and you're welcome to stay on if you like. Understand if you need to leave, that's fine as well, but thanks again.
Thank you so much, Bobby and Alex and everyone. Appreciate it.